We are talking the Wrestling Observer Newsletter Hall of Fame class of 2019 today with two of wrestling's finest historians, two guys who actually have very similar backgrounds in the same territory. Men who have published books, photographers, they've put out programs, they've done it all. I want to introduce the man behind Crowbar Press, who's typing away right now, it seems, Scott Teal, and of course, Mr. Jim Cornette. Guys, thank you for being on the line today.
Man, I'm glad to be here.
Well, Brian, by the way, I can tell you're flustered from that introduction because you didn't read it anything like how I wrote it. And but also you made one mistake. Scott and I are not historians. At our age, we're prehistorians.
Yes.
When I was in school, they didn't have history. So I had to learn this stuff after the fact.
Well, we're going to be talking a little bit about wrestling history today. We're going to talk a little bit about the 2019 class of the Wrestling Observer Newsletter Hall of Fame. Both of you are voters, and I'm just curious. I'm going to read off the names.
Yeah, this may have been my last year. I don't know. We'll see how that goes.
Well, let me read off the names of the people who got in and get your feelings and find out if any of the people who got in are people who were on your ballots. The people who got in this year were the Death Missionaries, Ultimo Guerrero, Gato, Viano 3, Dr. Wagner Jr., Jim Crockett Sr., and Bearcat Wright. Were any of those names on your ballot, Scott?
Yes, Crockett, now that I think about it, yeah, Crockett, I voted for Crockett, but I had a hard time deciding between him and Morris Siegel.
You know, well, we'll talk about that in a second. Jim, were any of these names on your ballot?
Yeah, well, actually, we were laughing right before we went on the air, if you can call this air. Ever since we've been on the air, people decided to quit breathing it. But we were talking, and I said, well, it's going to be easy to talk about this. None of my shit, got in. But actually, I believe I did. Yes, Jim Crockett Sr. Who was the list? Who were the candidates? Because apparently Scott and I, will bond on this. This is the only thing we have actually pertinent to talk about on the Hall of Fame issue. Who were the non-wrestling candidates? Because you can vote for any number of them. It doesn't count against the total or whatever the rule is. And I can tell you who I voted for there. Do you have that information?
The non-wrestling candidates this year were Lord James Blears, Dave Brown, Bob Caudle, Jim Crockett Jr. and Jim Crockett Sr., Gato, Jim Johnston, Larry Matisick, Stephanie McMahon, James Melby, Don Owen, Morris Siegel, George Scott, Naoki Sugabayashi.
All right. Well, he was on my list. Now go ahead.
Ted Turner, Stanley Weston, and the Grand Wizard.
Okay, basically, I think I'm pretty sure I voted for a Crockett, and I'm pretty sure it would have been Senior before Junior, because Senior never owed me any money.
Before we even talk about the Crockett's, let's go to Morris Siegel, because that's actually one that I petitioned Dave to get on the ballot. And I thought, it's not that I even think Morris Siegel should be on the ballot. The people I petitioned Dave for previously were Wild Bull Curry, now Morris Siegel. This year I said that Roy Welch should be on the ballot, but in actuality, I think these are three candidates that should have been inducted with the inaugural class, where Dave just anointed people who were clear-cut Hall of Famers into the Hall of Fame. Do you see it the same way, that these three historical figures are no-brainers? Jim, I'll go to you first.
Well, I don't know if Morris Siegel is a no-brainer. Wild Bull Curry is a no-brainer. How can you not have Wild Bull Curry in a pro wrestling Hall of Fame, whether for longevity, what did he wrestle 45 fucking years, whether for drawing power? He was a huge drawing card in at least 3 different decades. The classic name, the classic face, the fact that he was such a worker within his own gimmick, caused riots, tore the house down, just legendary character. That's one of those ones that stands out like the screen door on a submarine. So yeah, Wild Bull Curry, but Morris Siegel may not be a no-brainer. He's very important historically, but now that you mentioned Roy Welch, to be quite honest, if you're going for pioneer promoters and Roy Welch isn't in, Morris Siegel shouldn't be in either, because Roy Welch invented and controlled a genre of wrestling in a massive geographical area for 40 years, and Morris Siegel was the great promoter of Houston. But size-wise, impact-wise, Roy Welch at one point and the territory under him booked and employed more different wrestlers, maybe at not a high rate apiece, but more different talent and ran more towns than any other territory in the country.
Not only that, but he really pushed the smaller guys where most territories were going with the big guys. And it's flat. I mean, Nashville was on its tail end when Nick Gulas came in. It was Nick, but Roy was there behind him. But when Nick came into Nashville, man, the territory took off because they were pushing the junior heavyweight or the smaller guys. The guy that was promoting there, promoting the heavyweights, man, he was losing his shirt.
Well, yeah, and that's why Scott makes a good point. The Tennessee Territory, because of the fact that Roy Welch was behind the scenes, behind much of it, Nashville and Chattanooga, and in the early days, and then they added Birmingham, and then they added Memphis. But he was the link from the 30s to the 70s, and he saw what had worked, especially in Nashville. Pat Malone, the Green Shadow, was 5'7". And I mean, when I knew him, he was 200 pounds. He's a little doughier than back in the, in the day, a little fleshier. But those guys drew such massive amounts of money that's why the Tennessee always used big guys, as years went on, but the smaller guys, the action, the personal issues, and the violence, the heat of the thing is what, ran the Tennessee Territory and the, surrounding environment.
Scott, let me ask you, because I know that you're someone who in your years working for the Gulas Welch office, doing the programs, you actually had a really good positive experience and a good relationship with Nick Gulas. You've never had it.
Oh, absolutely. Right.
But you're aware that a lot of guys didn't, and there is a stigma about Nick Gulas. Do you think that hurts Roy Welch? Do you think people think Gulas Welch and whatever negative thoughts or connotations are there for Nick Gulas get automatically applied to Roy Welch?
No, not at all. I don't think they put, because you talk to anybody, most people say, Roy Welch was great and Nick Gulas was the jerk. But in all actuality, most of the time, Roy Welch was the jerk behind the scenes and he let Nick do all the dirty work. But what the problem is getting Roy Welch in is most of the people that are voting have no clue how much influence Roy Welch had on the business. They don't realize Roy Welch opened up Mississippi. He opened up territories and towns in Florida. He ran Tampa for a while. I never knew that up until, like 10 years ago. All of a sudden I discovered that and I think, well, my goodness, I had no clue. But Nick Gulas was even listed as the promoter in Tampa for several years. And I forget what the guy's name was.
That was back in the 40s, wasn't it, Scott?
Yes, I'd say the mid 40s. It was several years after he came in and promoted Nashville, probably 48, 47.
I've seen in one of your publications like a new promoter Nick Gulas runs event in Lake Worth, Florida, and that's the first I had ever known of Nick going down that far. But, he was a guy that had hustled. See, that's the thing. And Brian, from listening to Ron Fuller's stories, I don't want to say this in a bad way, but in the 30s and 40s, when these booking offices, before there were territories, because territories kind of came with television, but in the pre-TV days, they were booking offices, and there were central locations where a promoter and his booker controlled a group of guys, and they were sent out to different towns, and every town had a local promoter. It could be different. So while it wasn't a territory per se where the office was making all the money from these towns, the booking office was making money on talent. Did I kind of say that right, Scott?
Yes, absolutely. Absolutely. And that's what Roy Welch was doing.
Yeah, it was kind of like, I want to say this in a nice way, it was kind of like a legal version of the mob. Roy Welch and the Welch brothers, Herb Welch was a bigger star in the ring than Roy, bigger name, a box office attraction. But Roy and Herb as a team had been in so many places and done the first tag team matches. They had the first tag team match in Louisville in 1943. So together, Roy was kind of like the strong arm guy, and they went and opened up their version of this thing of ours, wrestling, in all these different states and areas. And you know that Roy passed that down to, he'd send his son then, Buddy Fuller, open up, Alabama or Louisiana. And then, that's how the Fullers, it was a family tradition from that point on. They would open up towns and territories and get TV somewhere, or open up a little circuit so that they could run shows. And that was their MO, but it all came from Roy. And he had a finger in everything south of Indiana except the Carolinas at one point or another in wrestling for 40 years.
One guy that doesn't get his due when we talk about Roy Welch and Nick Gulas and opening up all these towns and territories is Pat Malone. Pat Malone, I mean, I can't remember how long, but he sold out Nashville as the Green Shadow for like 12, 13 years, and he was never unmasked till the very end. And he used to be Roy's front man for a long time. He went down to Florida. He promoted, you mentioned Lake Worth, Jim. He went down and opened Lake Worth and ran the town for Roy. He went all over the place for Roy. Like I said, Pat Malone, he's another that should get his due for what he's contributed to the wrestling business. However, who knows the name Pat Malone? You know
Right.
him, I know him. But how many other people know who he was? Most people think the Green Shadow, just another mask guy. But I'm telling you what, he packed the arenas around here for year after year after year.
Well, your book, and I dare you to do the update from 1960 on, but your Nashville book shows that really the four biggest names in Nashville history as singles box office attractions would be Jerry Lawler, Jackie Fargo, Herb Welch, and Pat Malone, the Green Shadow. And I don't know if because of those, just the sheer length of time and the numbers that they drew, if Pat wouldn't have been above maybe even Lawler.
Yeah.
But anyway, Brian, what was your question?
I don't even remember. That was a while ago. But like I said before, I think that's part of the issue, that Roy Welch should be in the Hall of Fame, but I don't know if he should be on the ballot. I mean, this year, Paul Pons got into the Hall of Fame because he was a historical oversight. Someone from France who should have been put in. I really didn't know too much about his history.
I think he possibly should have been committed earlier than this. Was he related to the famous dancer Lily Pons?
I really don't know. But that's my point. I mean, who's going to be voting for Roy Welch? Modern wrestlers, modern reporters? I think that's a historical oversight. Someone who needs to be put in. But I would make the same argument for Morris Siegel, and I would actually do it based on who's already in. If Paul Bosch is in the Wrestling Observer Hall of Fame, and he should be, for 1967 to 1987. Morris Siegel ran Houston for almost 50 years. I just found a program the other day from, I think, 58, that it was about to celebrate his 40th anniversary as a promoter in Houston, Texas. He had Whisker Savage, he had Wild Bill Curry, he had Danny McShane. He had a lot of big stars. And of course, he gave Paul Bosch his break after Paul Bosch's injuries forced him out of the ring. I just think, how could you have Paul Bosch in the Hall of Fame and not have Morris Siegel? It seems
because Dave knew Paul. But no, so he can write from a firsthand perspective when he does the profiles, and people, it's a modern era of a lot of people are still around that grew up either watching Houston wrestling or trading for the coveted Mid-South tapes, and Paul Bosch was the guy then. But, that's, once again, I always voted for Jerry Jarrett, because how can you not have Jerry Jarrett in the Wrestling Hall of Fame, for heaven's sake? But if Jerry Jarrett goes in, then really Nick Gulas and Roy Welch would have to, because they ran the same territory for twice as long.
And, the argument I've heard against Nick Gulas is, and I know you guys have both heard it, he didn't pay well. He starved guys. Do you think that's a fair complaint, or do you think it's an unfair complaint?
I think it's unfair, and I'll tell you why. Nick was paying $15, $20 in the 60s and the early 70s. He was paying $25, $30 in the 76 on up. Jerry was paying $50, but Jerry never paid a whole lot more than that to a lot of the underneath guys. in the 70s and 80s or the 80s. So, you know, what's in the 80s, $50 wasn't worth much more than $25 was in the 70s. So, you know, I've heard a lot of stories on, you know, both sides, you know, so people always route at Nick. And Jim, you can address that better than I can. You got paid by Jerry.
Well, but here's the thing. There's a little bit of truth in everything. Nick was notorious for the underneath guys. He didn't give shit whether they stuck around or not because he had 1 million of them, and he had a closet, you know, full of masks where he could have 3 sets of Infernos on a given notice. And so he didn't care. The underneath guys could come and go. Bobby Eaton always tells a story about, you know, he loved to use the Mexicans, especially in the 50s and 60s, especially if they didn't have paperwork, because who are they going to complain to? You know, and the guy goes up and up, Mr. Nick, I need more money to, you know, pay for my family and food. Well, boy, what'd you make last week? Well, Mr. Nick, I only made $40. Well, it's not what you make, it's what you save, you know, but the guys that drew him money that were figured in, whether it be, you know, be the Green Shadows or the Herb Welches of the 50s, and whether it be the Fargos and Tojo and those guys in the 60s and 70s, he took care of them. I mean, you know, the story was Jackie Fargo in 1972 actually made over $100,000 working for Nick Gulas, which is like $7 million in anybody else's money. Yep. So, but you had to be figured in, and that's the way the wrestling business always was. But Nick was notorious for taking it to another level because he came from the Depression days, and he would use the illegal alien under a hood 3 times on one show and pay him once. And he would run those underneath guys off because he had a steady stream of 1 million of them. But, you know, he would always promise the top guys he wanted to take care of, boy, stick with me, you'll be farting through silk. You know, so there's truth on both ends. And Jerry was quite a bit the same way. He just wasn't quite as, he had a softer, more palatable demeanor when he was fucking you than Nick did.
Yeah, absolutely. Nick didn't mind telling you.
Yeah. And see, that's the thing. Roy was always the smart money. Roy was the guy. Roy Welch was the guy. Nick became his front man because he was still a top wrestler back when that really would have looked screwy to have the top guy be the promoter. So Nick was the front guy. He was the hustler. He was the guy that you know, could be the figurehead promoter, and Roy was the booker, the wrestling mind, the guy that called the shots. And he, from what I understand, let Nick, you know, do what he wanted when it didn't bother Roy. But what was the quote, Scott, when Memphis and Birmingham, when they both came into the fold, were both on Monday nights, and Nick was from Birmingham, so that was his crown jewel. He'd go down there every Monday and be the promoter. Whereas Roy had sent Buddy Fuller down. He's the one that got Memphis, and he would go to Memphis, and he always said whatever happened in the rest of the territory, the quote, I believe, was, I'll never let the Greek handle Memphis.
Yep. And
that's how Memphis ended up being the place where Nick had the least amount of stroke, and Jerry was able to take it away from him later on.
Yes, absolutely. And you going back to the him using the underneath guys, the Mexicans, the guy, you know, Brian, you said something a little bit ago about Nick was good to me. And yes, he was. He never gave me a problem. I mean, he let me do the program, sell the programs, never asked me for a penny. And how many promoters wouldn't take a percentage? But Nick, if he needed you, he would treat you like gold. That's why Jackie Fargo did so well. That's why so many of the top guys did well. But if he didn't need you, he wouldn't pay you he'd pay you as little as he possibly could. He knew I didn't need him. I was in college, you know. I mean, he knew I loved the business and I loved what I was doing, but it wasn't like I was going to starve to death or had a family to feed. So he treated me well because I was doing a good job for him with the programs and the publicity and the photos. So that, you know, that's why he treated me well. But if I had come in there, you know, if I'd become a wrestler or a manager and decided to do that, which I never had any interest in, but if I had done that, I'll guarantee you I would have starved to death because that's exactly what he would have done to me.
Hey, I'll tell you, Michael St. John told me a story that I don't remember the particulars, and it's not germane, but the overreaching point of the thing was that Michael's wife had gotten ill and they had some medical bills or whatever. And Nick just happened to hear about it somehow or whether they were discussing, and he went in the safe in the office and pulled out, he said, "How much was it, boy?" Pulled out whatever it was and handed it to him, said, "Here you go. Don't worry about it. We'll talk about it later." And just because I guess the story goes, Scott, you might know that the last office building that Nick had built only a couple of years before he went out of business there in Nashville. Yep. The story I always heard was that he paid cash for it, and not cash like I'll write you a check and you cash it, but he just went in his office safe and pulled out like 180 grand in cash. And
unbelievable. I've never heard that.
I've heard that story from a couple different people that actually had been in that office. Because that's what Brian and I have talked on the program so many times about being a wrestling promoter and having a territory like that in those days was a license to print money. Especially the spot shows when you had Eddie Marlin coming back from whatever town, or Lynn Rossi coming back from whatever town, or Pat Malone from whatever town with a briefcase with a 44 Magnum and $5,000 in cash inside of it. Two or three different places every night.
That's right.
But yeah, if you were important, that was one thing he learned from all the wrestling promoters. If you were important to Nick, you get taken care of. But if you weren't, then it was dependent on whether he liked you or not, I guess.
How much stock do you put in the story that Nick acted the way he did because the wrestlers used to mistreat him? I just don't believe that. I mean, I just don't see that. He worked for Chris Jordan, and people say, well, he worked for Chris, and when he went on trips, the guys would put him on the floor. I don't believe that in a second. I think Nick was just Nick.
Go ahead and finish it. The story was, I sound like Lawler now, trying to egg something out of Lance Russell. The story was always told was that Nick was so hostile to the boys because when he was the flunky in Alabama, poster boy or whatever.
Yeah.
For Chris Jordan, that they would throw him in the back of those big 30s sedans and throw garbage on him and piss on him while he was on the floor. All the boys would. And he ended up owning the territory and getting even. And that's probably, once again, is probably apocryphal in some description, and probably is, I'm sure a lot of it happened because, there's those wrestlers pushing this fucking little kid around, a little kid, 20-year-old guy, flunky around the promoter. And then all of a sudden, Roy Welch, who's figured in with the Welch brothers, and they're all fucking shooters, takes the kid under his wing because he's a fast talker and he looks good in a suit and he can be the front man. And the worm turns. And all of a sudden, Nick is pissed, throwing garbage and pissing on the boys. There may be a little, who knows? It was 8 years ago.
Yeah.
I'll tell you what, guys, I want to move on with a couple other names that got in.
Yeah, because we don't even know how to pronounce any of the rest of the people who got indicted.
Well, names that got in, names that didn't. But before we move on, real quick, do you guys think Nick Gulas is a Hall of Famer?
I do, but it's like Roy Welch. Who's going to vote for him? Roy, and even Mars Siegel. Mars Siegel was a huge name, but he's got the guy I can believe that got Texas wrestling started. The TV program. I'd have to read up on that, but there's so many guys like them that deserve to be in the Hall of Fame. When you look back at some of the past guys that have gotten in, there's a lot of guys, the older time guys that should have been in before them, but they'll never get in because the guys that are voting they don't know who they are. We're always back to that same thing.
I think, Nick, as part of Nick Gulas and Roy Welch, the Gulas Welch Enterprises, you would be a Hall of Fame name in wrestling. But if you go to the root of the matter, it's like if Nick Gulas and Roy Welch in 1940 something would have been like Jim Crockett and Dusty Rhodes. If you're going to put one of them in, Roy Welch was the guy that was the wrestling guy. And Crockett was the guy only, in this case, Crockett was probably, the whole Crockett family were owners, whereas, Nick had half, blah, 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 and Dusty didn't have a piece of it. But you know what I'm saying? The Booker wrestler guy behind the scenes is sometimes gets my nod over the businessman.
And you know what? Jim Crockett, who made the Hall of Fame, I mean, everything I've heard is he didn't do a lot of the booking. He was just behind the scenes. He had the money.
Yeah.
And yet you have Morris Siegel. I'll guarantee Morris Siegel was doing the booking.
Well, they actually had the booking office until Morris Siegel died. And Paul Boesch took over and thought he was taking over the Houston booking office. And then Fritz von Erich said, oh, no. It will now be the Dallas booking office. And that led to...
He said, oh, no.
He said, oh, no. And that led to years of acrimony behind the scenes between Fritz and Paul Boesch, eventually, years later, leading to Houston having nothing to do with Fritz von Erich. But it was the Houston booking office, not the Dallas booking office, that controlled most of Texas wrestling outside of, West Texas.
Right. But when you look at the Observer ballot, the Observer results, Jim Crockett got 63% of the vote. And what did Morris Siegel get? 29%. I just don't see that.
But you know what?
That's crazy.
There's never been a Siegel Cup in the NWA. There's never been that seriously, the 80s round of pay-per-view, the Crockett name is still fondly remembered because it was the last stand of the NWA as a lot of people knew it back then. So I think it's
which brings us right back to what we were talking about a while ago.
Yeah.
A lot of these guys, Roy Welch will never get in because nobody knows who they are.
Well, let me ask you before we move on with this conversation. Jim Crockett Sr. got in. Do you think Jim Crockett Jr. is a Hall of Famer? I'll go to you first, Scott, because Jim obviously worked for him and eventually was owed money by him at the end of when Turner Broadcasting took over. But do you see Jim Crockett Jr. as a Hall of Famer?
I believe so. Given the fact that he took his, he had his money and he thought he used it the way he thought it should be and built the business. But I don't know as far as, I don't know. It depends on how you look at it. Again, Morris Siegel, what a great mind he had for the business. Like I said, I guarantee he was booking. But Jim Crockett Jr., I don't think he ever booked. Jimmy, you probably know more about whether he did or not, but I don't think so. He had Senior even, his Senior didn't book that much. He had Becker booking, Johnny Weaver. He had all those guys underneath booking. And so I don't know. That's a hard question.
Jim Crockett Jr. booked for about 6 weeks when TBS bought the company from in between Dusty and George Scott. And boy, there was no call for him to book anymore after those 6 weeks. And I think he knew it himself. Here's the thing with Jim Jr., and I'm not trying to, and I've made the money back since then that he owed me on the Mid-Atlantic films that TBS tossed out. But Jim Crockett Sr. starts the territory, becomes a legendary figure, runs that thing for almost 40 years, is universally respected amongst the boys, is a gregarious fellow by all accounts. And Jim Jr. was not the choice to run the company. When Jim Sr. passed away, it was John Ringley, who was married to Frances Crockett. John Ringley is the one. Did. Well, we know what he did, but before he did that, he's the one that brought in George Scott. He's the one that okayed the expansion into a major singles territory, using more national names from the comfort zone that they had been in all those years. So indirectly, then he's responsible for Valentine and Wahoo. Then he's also responsible for, letting Mr. Johnson and the Twins out in unsolicited bandyings with other people besides the Crockett family, namely Francis, and so they kicked him out of the family. And then Jim Jr. is now the choice when all this stuff has been set in motion. And he had another 13 years where he was the head of the company when it was one of the most successful territory in the country and had the best talent and the best bookers. So, and then he didn't keep on top of things and was led to believe things that he was going to get the TV revenue and the pay-per-view and the blah, blah, blah. And they ended up in the soup. So I'm not sure there needs to be some other promoters in the Hall of Fame first, I think.
Well, let's talk about bookers because we're talking about Crockett Promotions. George Scott didn't get in. And obviously, Jim, you did not like George Scott and George Scott didn't know who you guys were.
Yeah.
But taking that out of it, do you think as a booker, George Scott should be in?
Absolutely. Don Owen got 59% of the vote. What did George Scott get? 19%. And Scott, but Don Owen, I mean, all you hear is good about him. I've heard a few people didn't like what he did, but things he did, but Don Owen, I don't believe, did a lot of the booking. He didn't do anything as much for the business as George Scott did. George Scott not only was a great booker, but he was a great wrestler in his day. As far as I'm concerned, he should be in long, but he is way at the bottom of the list, and I just don't understand that. And right below him on the results list on this, and this is going off the track, but is the Von Brauners and Saul Weingroff with 19% of the vote. Yeah. Go figure. They drew money for decades, and yet they're at the bottom of the list.
I vote for the Von Brauners and Saul every year and the Anderson brothers, only because how can you have a wrestling Hall of Fame without the Von Brauners and fucking Saul and the Andersons? But back to George Scott, I might put him in the Hall of Fame as a wrestler before a booker. And I'll tell you why, because he was a good booker in the standpoint that he picked the right guys to get started with in the Carolinas. Johnny Valentine and Wahoo McDaniel and a few of the other acquisitions that he made. But then, and actually from what I've heard from a lot of the guys, his talent as the booker was picking all this talent and then saying, what do you guys want to do? And Blackjack Mulligan and Flair would go in and pitch something. And then they'd get something pitched from Wahoo McDaniel. And then here would be, some other, the NWA champions are coming in and go, well, I could do this deal of the bounty. All George Scott had to do was assimilate all that. He had the best and the smartest talent, because what did he do? That's what you hear. George Scott booked the Carolinas into the glory period. That was from 1975 or maybe 74, right? Until he left in 1982. Where was he ever successful again?
Right. I agree with you there.
Again, he worked for Vince for a couple of years and actually quit over WrestleMania because he thought it was too fucking showbiz hogwash, right? So you could tell him and Vince were not going to be long term. But he booked for Leroy McGurk for a minute. He booked Dallas and brought in Bam Bam Bigelow as a Russian. And then he was done. Everything else was a complete flop. He tried South Atlantic in Charlotte. He was the original booker of that. It didn't work. So, I'm chalking up a lot of George Scott to having the best all-star roster of talent and saying, hey, what do you guys want to do with each other? Because that's the way they did it in the Carolinas anyway. They brought in the Kentuckians, got them over, and then they said, well, hey, we worked this program with Hamilton and Renesto. Let's bring them in, and that's what they would do.
The Von Brauners and Saul Weingroff was brought up, and obviously, as Scott, you said, they drew money everywhere, and whether it's Tennessee, whether it's Florida, everywhere they went, they were a major attraction. Why do you think they've, obviously, if a lot of people don't know them or aren't aware of them, and there isn't a lot of video footage, it's easy to overlook them, but do you think there's a reason why they're overlooked beyond that, and give their case for being Hall of Famers?
Which one?
I don't know. I don't know why they're overlooked. I mean, other than the fact we keep going back to the same thing with the people voting today, that most of them don't even know anything about the Von Brauners. They don't know. They don't study history. They don't go back and look at what the houses were like. Look at old records and look at old matches, and they just don't do that. So I think that's the whole problem with this whole system. I really believe that. It's just the people voting, and I'm not putting down those people, but they just don't understand, the business back then, because they haven't studied it. They haven't studied the history. But as far as making a case for it, I mean, it's a no-brainer. If you go back and look at those records, Jim can tell you this: the Von Brauners, everywhere they went, they made money. And I'm even talking about the later incarnations of the von Brauners, you know, the von, or even the von Stroheims, they drew good money, and they didn't do anything near what the von Brauners did. And I think a lot of what the von Brauners did so well was because they had Saul. Man, I hated Saul's guts. I mean, he was I told Herbie Weingroff on Facebook one day, he posted something about his dad. I said, your dad is a rat-faced, sniveling, cowardly, I forget what it was. And I said all this stuff, and I said, it's funny how we love that guy now. And he thought that was really funny, but that's, everybody hated Saul Weingroff. I mean, he had this look about him. He didn't even have to say anything or do anything. You just hated him.
No, he looked like the classic, out of Central Casting, the classic mobster or shady, grimy, sleazy used car salesman. That fucking Brillo pad hair. Yes, Snidely Whiplash. That Brillo pad hair all over his body, his big bushy eyebrows, the big nose, the surly, frown, the fucking hat and the cane and the voice and just disdain. He was just an unlikable, surly looking human being. And the von Brauners were these big, bald Nazis. Fucking less than 15 years after the war when it started. But the two things. Number one, as Scott mentioned, before video, there's no video around. There's, it's right that era before. But secondly, they never worked New York. And they never worked New York, so they never got in the mainstream magazines. They were always in Wrestling Review in the 60s instead of the big publications, and later on the After magazines as they became known. They were still the von Brauners were a main event team in the early 70s. And, since the 1950s, they had about a 15-year run. And you almost never saw them on the major mainstream magazines because they didn't ever work either the AWA or like Chicago, the Midwest, or the Northeast, the WWF, but they were constantly the top team in Florida or Georgia or the giant Tennessee territory or Texas, and especially in the territories that were weekly towns, because they would have so much heat. They'd draw every week over and they'd start riots. People try to hit the ring on them and get bopped by Saul's cane with the fucking lead in it and everything. But that's why people not only have not seen them because it's before video, but also they don't have a ton of publicity that's still outstanding. But when you add up all the huge runs they had in the various smaller territories, they were one of the top box office teams in the business.
And if you rate them by the number of riots they had, they'd be right on top.
A name that did get in is Bearcat Wright, and he's someone who's been on the cusp of getting in for several years. Obviously a major drawing card in Chicago. He was really one of the key cogs in the last great period of Fred Kohler's promoting life. Him, Buddy Rogers, there's a few other names. Big star in Los Angeles. Of course, he had problems there eventually, but that's the story in a lot of places where he goes in and becomes a big star. He has problems with the office, or in that case, it was with Fred Blassie, I guess, started it. And he disappears. He was the world champion there, first African-American world champion. What are your thoughts on Bearcat Wright? Let me go to you first, Jim.
Well, and I think he was big also in like the Pittsburgh, Cleveland, Buffalo area in the early. He was huge, period, in the early 60s, and he had somewhat of the dribble effect in the mid-late 60s, but he had cooled off because, like you said, every time he got featured somewhere, there was an issue. I don't think the thing with Blassie was an issue with Fred Blassie personally. I've always heard it's just he was like, no, I'm not fucking dropping the belt. And he's a 6'6", 260-pound former pro boxer, and Blassie then is almost fucking 50, right? So it didn't end well for Blassie, and Blassie didn't know it was coming. And he still got chances after that, which is testimony to how big a drawing card he was at one time. But I don't know. I think for historical value, yes, for historical value, as he was the first African-American world champion of a title that was recognized at least semi-legitimately, and for a brief period of time, such a gate attraction, but then his own self-inflicted problems such as not wanting to drop titles, double-crossing people, always being the complainer in the situation. After the 60s, he was basically nowhere, and he had that one run as a manager in the mid-70s, probably because he needed money. Scott, you were in Nashville during that time. He came in with the Stomper.
Yeah, he came in right after I went to work for Nick. He came. He's real nice. I enjoyed talking with him. I didn't, he wasn't around long, just 2-3 weeks, I guess. So,
but I mean, had he been working anywhere before that, or did he just pop back into the business?
He worked in Florida for a short time in Tampa for 72, maybe early 73. I think it was 72. But he was in there for a short time with Bobby Shane and that group, and. That I can remember, I don't remember him making any big inroads anywhere, after the late 60s.
I'll tell you, he was not in Louisville as long as he was in the rest of the Tennessee Territory that summer, because that's one of the first pictures I ever gave to Christine Jarrett was the pictures I took of him knocking the shit out of this guy in Louisville. He's managing the Stomper as Bearcat Wright, right? And he's 6'7", and he's 260, like I said, and he's just an imposing looking guy. And this drunk guy comes up, and Bearcat Wright is looking at the ring. He's got his back turned to the people, and this drunk guy just walks up behind him, and all he had was the little rope around the ring in those days. And the guy reaches out and grabs Bearcat's arm like he's going to spin him around, right? And when he grabs his arm, Bearcat does spin around. And the guy punched, and this guy was about 5'6" and about 160. And the guy punched straight out and hit Bearcat Wright in the stomach. And it was Wright just looked at for 1 second, just looked down, didn't sell it at all. And then I didn't know he was a boxer at the time. All of a sudden, pap, pap, a right and a left. The guy was knocked out from it was a left and a right. The guy was knocked out from the left before the right hit, but the right hit him because it was so fast he hadn't fallen yet. And then when the guy landed, he drew back with these big cowboy boots he had on, these size 16 fucking shoes, and kicked the guy right in the side of the fucking head. Boom. And that was his evening. That guy was colder than a banker's heart. And it took like 1.7 seconds. And after that, that's why Teeny requested the pictures. I got a chance to take 3 pictures. One of the guy hitting Bearcat, one of Bearcat hitting him, and one of him standing on the guy's head when he was down on the ground before the cops got there. And Bearcat, I don't believe, came back he might have been back one more time, and then the lawsuit came in, and he was never back to Louisville.
Christine asked you to take those pictures?
Well, no, she asked for copies of them because I saw the guy walk up, and I said, and I had my little Kodak Instamatic at the time.
That's what I was wondering, because I know you weren't in the business at the time.
Yeah, no, I was just still sitting on the front row, right, with my Instamatic. And I knew Teeny because we would talk at the gimmick table, right? But when I saw the guy walk up, I said, "Oh, this is rich," and I was able to snap those. And she said, "I may need those for evidence." I used to hate you, by the way, Scott Teal. I used to hate you every time I'd see your name in the magazine. Before I got in the business, because I was just with the Instamatic in the front row, and I wouldn't get to hang around with all these wrestlers, and I'd see your pictures. They're posing for him. He gets to meet these people. That no good piece of shit. Holy mackerel. Yeah, you had a lot of heat with me.
I love it.
And funny enough, because we mentioned Pat Malone earlier, the first photos of Jim's in the magazines, or at least a lot of the early ones, were credited to Pat Malone.
Yeah, yes.
That's hilarious. I didn't know that.
Well, yeah, because remember, he was the one in charge of selling the wrestling news. That was one of his very tasks besides watching the back door. And he wanted all the guys from Tennessee to be on the covers so that he'd sell more magazines. So he'd get pictures and send them to Norm Keitzer and say, "Print this, boy." And well, Norm, he didn't know who the fuck Pat Malone was. He just knew that Pat was the guy that was selling his magazines in Tennessee, right? So when he sent those pictures, okay, photo by Pat Malone.
That's hilarious.
I mean, he could have sent some guy's driver's license picture, and Norm Keitzer would have still credited photo by Pat Malone.
That's just great.
Let me ask you guys about another name, someone who has been very close to getting in but hasn't yet, and that's Sputnik Monroe. Obviously, there's been a big groundswell of support behind him. A lot of people specifically pointing to 1959, the desegregation of wrestling shows at the Ellis Auditorium. Do you think that's enough to put him in? And do you think people are overlooking more of his career when they talk about Sputnik Monroe as a Hall of Famer?
I would have to say yes on Sputnik Monroe. In fact, he fell just let me see, just a 3 points shy of Bearcat Wright. So he's right on the cusp of being in. I do think his early days, late 50s, probably through the mid 60s, was probably his best years. Of course, later on he teamed up with Bill Fletcher in the mid 60s as Bill was Rocket Monroe. Then he met Maury High later on and named him Rocket Monroe, and they had a good run then too. But to me, Sputnik by probably the 1970, 71, I believe his career had really cooled off. But I wouldn't say his career was any less spectacular or shorter than Bearcat Wright. So I would say he's right in there. And I don't want to get off. Well, I want to go back to Sputnik. Let Jim get back on Sputnik. But there's a couple guys to me is the same way who had, I feel like, stellar careers compared to Bearcat or even compared to Sputnik Monroe. And that's Cowboy Bob Ellis for one. Yeah. And the other is Enrique Torres. And neither one of them has made it. And I just don't understand that.
I voted for Enrique Torres this year, and I completely agree with you. But, Jim, let's go back to Sputnik or anything you want to add.
Well, Bob Ellis, I'm with you on it because every time you read something about the mid-late 50s, early 60s, mid-60s, Bob Ellis was one of the most over baby faces in the business and was a huge draw. And so over Bruiser, I was watching Bob Ellis on Bruiser's TV in 1973, for fuck's sake, because Bruiser took everybody was over. The biggest attractions of the 50s were working for Bruiser in the 70s. Bob Ellis should be Sputnik. Not only the huge run in Memphis and the groundbreaking shit, and not even just the desegregation issue, but and not even just the big house, but the amount of big houses against Billy Wicks, and that he was all over. He was a cultural figure in Memphis. He was in a newspaper constantly. They still remember him, obviously, to this day, but that overlooks he worked on top in Georgia and Louisiana. He was the Fuller's go-to heel when they opened a territory. Just his work, because he was ahead of his time with taking the big bumps and everything, but he was also ahead of his time with promos. He was one of the first heel promo guys when they started doing heel promos. So yeah, you got to have Sputnik Monroe in a Wrestling Hall of Fame. It's crazy that he wouldn't be.
Yeah. Yep.
And somebody on Twitter said, "Who's this Sputnik Monroe guy, and how did he get more votes than CM Punk?" And that's why I hate wrestling these days, because of some of the people that watch it.
Another interesting result here was how good James Melby did in the ballot.
I was going to bring that. I was getting ready to bring that up. Go right ahead. I'm sorry.
Well, let me just say, in the last few years, we've lost several of wrestling's premier historians: Fred Hornby, Jim Zordani, of course, J. Michael Kenyon, and shortly before them, James Melby. How do you guys feel about wrestling historians being on the ballot for the Wrestling Observer Hall of Fame? And what are your specific thoughts about Jim Melby and his candidacy?
Well, for one thing, it's a different category. It's non-performer. So I'm tickled to death to know, because before it's always been ring announcers, not timekeepers, but ring announcers or help me here. Managers, managers, promoters, you name it. But I'm tickled to death that Jim Melby was on this in somewhat of a boost, so that historians are a big part of saving the history of the business. And it's like I said at CAC when I got the historian award there, I had everybody that was a historian award stand up, and I said, I want all you wrestlers to look at these guys that are standing up, because if it weren't for these guys right here, nobody would know who any of you are. And that's exactly the truth. The historians like Jim Melby and J. Michael Kenyon, Burt Ray. I just found a newsletter today, an old bulletin by Burt Ray. He used to put Matt Mania. It was an absolutely great bulletin for its time. People like him, ought to be in the Hall of, in the or at least have an opportunity to be in the non-performer Hall of Fame. Whether they ever get in or not, I don't know. But I think it's great that Jim got 33% of the vote. Now, I don't know if that means overall vote for everything the way it's listed. It doesn't really break it down for non-performers. He just got 33% because Dave Meltzer lists everybody that was on every ballot in one list. So to get 33% of the vote, I think it's great. Dave Brown, he got 31%. So that says a little bit something about Jim Melby's credibility.
Yeah, I think that like Scott, when he said if nobody would know who a lot of you guys are if it wasn't for these people, it's not a performers category, but it is an important category in terms of preserving the history and the whole reason why there is a Hall of Fame, whether it's baseball or football or whatever the sport or the occupation for the Hall of Fame. If you don't acknowledge the history of the thing, then you have no context. One of the reasons why some of these pioneers in all sports are in the halls of fame is because they were such standouts that nobody has yet in modern day been able to top their achievements. Well, how do we know if anybody's topping these achievements or not if we don't keep record of the achievements? So, yeah, I like the idea of there being a historian category. And you just mentioned a bunch of guys that would qualify.
And, not only that, but the fact that, you talk about all these like football and baseball, these statistics and all. Problem with wrestling, it's worse because they definitely, you've got all these magazines for football and all these other sports that go way back with all the statistics. Wrestling didn't have it. They had the after magazines. There's no credibility to any of that. I'm not putting down what Bill did. What I'm saying is there's no real meat in those magazines as far as what wrestlers have done and their, what kind of houses they drew, how many butts in the seats. So the wrestling historians really are, as far as any sport goes, are probably more important than any other sport because you really have to dig to get true information and not just the bogus stuff put out in programs and magazines by promoters.
On that topic, let me ask you guys about a couple more names before we wrap things up. But Stanley Weston is on the ballot, and I'm curious what you guys think about his candidacy for the Hall of Fame. Obviously, so many people point to Bill Apter, and they say the Apter mags, but those magazines existed for years before he got there. Do you think Stanley Weston's a Hall of Famer? Was he hands-on enough, or was he more like a Jim Crockett Sr. for his magazines? Jim, I'll go to you first. Do you look at Stanley Weston and you say that's a wrestling Hall of Famer?
No. Well, no, here's the thing. From what I'd never met the gentleman, but from what I've been able to determine, he got into wrestling magazines because he was a magazine publisher. And he saw that there was a market for a magazine about wrestling. And I understand, and this is what I think Bill Apter doesn't knock anybody, and I'm not asking him to knock anybody, but he does mention that when he first started working for the magazines, a lot of the boys would not talk to him or didn't necessarily trust him because of all the Stanley Weston in the 60s had gone into the scandal confidential movie magazine, lurid headlines and had written some shit. And several of the guys had heat with these guys. And they were like, wait a minute now, you Bill Apter, you're writing for that Stanley Weston? No, I ain't going to talk to you. And Bill had to kind of forge a relationship with him a little better. Purely for making sure that especially in some down periods, there were newsstand magazines about wrestling on the newsstands. That's due to Stanley Weston, but I don't really see that he did any particular personal work in his writing or anything else that would qualify him as a Hall of Famer.
Talk about Stanley Weston, then you got to talk about Burt Sugar in ring wrestling.
And that's the last thing we want to talk about is Burt Sugar.
Well, I know that, but yeah, I mean, to me, Stanley Weston, there's a guy head and shoulders above Stanley Weston should be in there due to the amount of work he did both in the days as a fan and then later on, and that's Norm Keizer.
Well, there you go. He actually was in the wrestling business. He was in it. He printed the programs. He went to shows. He knew the boys, etc.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
Yeah. His name should be up there long before Stanley Weston. And I don't know why he's not even on the ballot if they're considering Stanley Weston. I don't know where the names come from, but Norman definitely should be in there.
The guy that sort of started McDonald's. Is why, instead of the place that serves better hamburgers, but it didn't have the publicity.
Yeah, that's true. Yeah.
Well, let me ask you guys about another name who was new to the ballot this year. I voted for him. I'm curious your thoughts on Ted Turner as a Wrestling Observer Newsletter Hall of Famer.
No, he didn't have anything to do. I'm sorry. Go ahead.
Well, no, I think we're both going to say the same thing. Not no, but hell no. I mean, once again, he's an incredibly important figure in the wrestling industry, but not because he was ever really in wrestling. Even when he owned a wrestling company, he wasn't in the wrestling business. I saw Fritz more than I saw Ted Turner. Fritz would come down to TV every once in a while. I worked for fucking TBS for 3 years, never saw Ted Turner, but I ran into him one time at the commissary downstairs at Techwood, but that was accidental. He was a very important figure, but had absolutely nothing to do with the wrestling business except preserving it for others to perpetrate it.
Yeah, he didn't have any hands-on anything to do with the wrestling business other than, the company and
wait a minute,
providing a place.
Ann Gunkel may wonder whether he had any hands-on experience, but we won't go there.
Before we devolve into the bottom of the toilet, one last name to ask you about here. He is being added back to the ballot next year. He was never on as a singles wrestler or as a singular person. You mentioned earlier, Jim, you voted for the Anderson brothers in the past. Ole Anderson as a single, or at least as like I said, someone who was a promoter, a booker, and a wrestler, is being added back to the ballot. I'm a big believer that Ole Anderson's a clear-cut Hall of Famer. Scott, I'll go to you first because you actually did Ole Anderson's book Inside Out with him. What are your thoughts on Ole Anderson as a Hall of Famer?
I mean, he had a great career. I mean, look at all he did. I mean, between being a great man on the mic, great wrestler, him and Gene, of course, that's sort of where they were going before as a tag team, but Ole had a stellar career. And not only that, but he had a great career behind the scenes as a booker. But I have always said the reasons Ole will never get into the Hall of Fame as a single is because a lot of the wrestlers that are voting hate his guts. And that will stop it right there. They won't vote for him and I hate to say it, but a lot of guys won't vote the way they should if they went by, statistics and crowds and everything else because of personal feelings. And I don't know, Jim can probably weigh on that as well.
Well, yeah, all-time great promo, great look, great matches, great heat, long-term, multiple-decade track record of drawing money, dominated 2 territories, Georgia and the Carolinas, to the point where he never needed to go anywhere else, and at some points was a main event talent on television in both territories and booking one or the other. Was making $250,000 in the late 70s in wrestling because he, had a mind for booking as well as being a top main event talent. How can that guy not be a Hall of Famer?
Mm-hmm.
I'm just, sorry.
You were there with him a little bit. Do you think as a booker, he is hurt by 1983 and 1990? Do you think because of that, people overlook his strong booking before that? And again, at one point, he was booking Georgia and Mid-Atlantic at the same time.
Yeah. Well, in 1983, Georgia just was falling apart because the aftermath of Barnett and talent was coming in and out, but they were also going to Japan, and it was just 1983 Georgia was a mess, and less said about 1990 whatever WCW the better, but he had been successful and good for a long period of time, even before that popcorn started popping in the background.
I'm sorry, I was scooting some stuff.
But yeah, so I mean, it just do we take Earth, Wind and Fire's last album out on them, or do we think about the entire body of work up until that point?
Right.
On that topic, I said one last name before I lied.
How about one last album? Yeah, I got family to attend to.
One last name.
The other thing about those later years is Ole wasn't allowed to book the way he used to book because he had so many people in his ear, corporate and also, WCW guy.
Also, he didn't care. At that point, he didn't care because he had tried to retire around 85-ish, 86-ish after that little run, and they kept, but we need you to do one thing, and he didn't care.
Yep.
One name I vote for every year, and he doesn't get in, is the Junkyard Dog, just because I believe it's undeniable how successful he was in not just in Mid-South Wrestling, but in transforming Louisiana into being a major territory, which led to Bill Watts having the opportunity to take over Oklahoma. Jim, you were there. What are your thoughts on the Junkyard Dog as a Hall of Famer?
Well, yeah, I'm actually had forgotten or would have mentioned that first. Well, how can Bearcat Wright go in the Hall of Fame and the Junkyard Dog is not there? Because think about this. Dog was just as hot in a smaller part of the country as Bearcat Wright was in Chicago or Los Angeles. Dog
for as long a time?
What was it, 78 to 84 in Mid-South?
79, I would say.
Okay, I didn't realize.
79 to 84,
okay.
And actually was more important to the culture in that part of the country and just people that go to the mall, and the Saints chant, everybody knew Dog.
Yep.
Whereas I don't think Bearcat Wright lit Los Angeles on fire. And, I'm sure he had some competition in Chicago for celebrity status. They were neither one of them were Jack Briscoe and Dory Funk Jr. in the ring, but so yeah, that's a glaring omission. Also, how can JYD not be in a wrestling Hall of Fame for what he did? You don't get that. You don't get that hot, that kind of impact, and people still remember you, 20 years later. And he would go in, he got over in Houston, even before Houston was a Mid-South town. The only reason he didn't get over more places was because after Mid-South, he went to the WWF, and, the drugs and the complacency, made him fat and lazy. But he had the ability when he was hot to get over anywhere.
And that's where we get back to your pick, Jim, Bull Curry. He's the same way. He was as hot or drew as much as Junkyard Dog did for a long time. Texas,
for a much
all
longer
over.
period of time. Yeah.
Yep.
Do you think the Dog is hurt similar to Ole Anderson by that last Earth, Wind and Fire album? Because so many people think of him from 85 on when he gained weight, when he had substance abuse problems. But look, there are guys in the Hall of Fame. Tiger Mask is in the Hall of Fame for 2 years. I don't know why they're on the ballot this way, but they got a lot of votes. Tully Blanchard and Arn Anderson with J.J. Dillon as a combination. They were only a combination as an actual team for 2 years, 2.5 years?
Yeah.
And they're there. How do you deny the 5 years that JYD had in Mid-South Wrestling? To me, it's undeniable. But again, I think too many people look at the last several years of his albums and they go, well, he was fat, he was lazy in the ring, he had the worst Ric Flair match in 1990 that anyone had ever seen.
And that goes back to what we were talking about earlier. What do these guys that are voting, what do they really know about him? They know he was hot for a while, but then they probably remember, like you said, the bad years, the drug years. So all that probably, they don't study history. We keep coming back to this whole Hall of Fame discussion today. To me, I think the thing that's jumped out at me the most is the fact that most people do not, the wrestlers, fans, they do not study history. They know a little bit about it, but they don't study it enough to really realize who made the impacts, who was big names. You ask most people today about Bearcat Wright, they couldn't tell you the first thing about him. Except he was a big name in Chicago for a while, So, I don't know.
I concur wholeheartedly.
I agree as well. But Scott, as we close things out, you mentioned before there was someone at the bottom of the list you wanted to talk about. Why don't we end this segment with you talking about, I'm not sure who you want to talk about, but let's hear it.
The one that's on the very bottom of the list is Don Fargo. People don't realize, but Don Fargo main evented every single territory he went to. And I'm talking about from L.A., Cleveland, Nashville, everywhere. He was on top. He was a main event guy. Chicago, man, they sold. Yeah, New York. Absolutely. They sold out Chicago over and over. Him and what's his name? Kenny Mack. I mean, he was a huge name every single territory he went to, but why he doesn't get more votes than that, I don't know. But there's names above him that didn't have near the impact that he did over the years.
Well, I can tell you why. Because, number one, he did all that under about 15 different names.
Well, that's part, yes.
And secondly, it's almost all before video, even though there are still some matches, in his final years in the ring. He did those showboat tapings in Vegas for the AWA in the mid-'80s. He's the only guy. His career started when wrestling was on the Dumont Network, and he was on it, and he hung around long enough to be on ESPN.
Close it out.
But, that's another one of those guys that he's overlooked because he was always a member of a team. He changed gimmicks. It was before the video era. But when you talk about his influence, I mean, he and Jackie gave birth to the Fabulous Ones, which gave birth to rock and roll tag teams. There would be no Rock and Roll Express. There might not be anybody wearing bandanas if it wasn't for the Fargos, because you can trace the lineage back. He was a main event guy in every territory. He did everything. And if as far as longevity, it was, over 30 years. So, that's enough. And the Fargos, as far as at the box office, they sold out the Garden. They sold out the northeastern cities. Yes, it was with Rock and Perez, but then they came to Nashville and came to Tennessee and sold out so much for so long that 30 years later, they were able to base a tag team off of the fucking guys that hadn't been wrestling in 20 fucking years. So, yeah, but we could make a lot of cases for a lot of these guys, and it just comes down to there's so many, and people, as you said, Scott, know so little.
Yes.
Well, it seems like a great place to end this segment. So,
boy, it sure does. My in-laws are screaming at me now.